right, welcome back to another episode of A Fresh Perspective with Chef Charles, where I have another fire conversation for you and an excellent discussion on the school issue. But before we get into everything, before I bring on my guest, be sure to like this video, share this video, and subscribe. Hit that subscribe button and that notification bell. That way you'll be notified whenever I upload a new interview, which I do every Wednesday and Friday evening at 7 o'clock Eastern Standard. Now, we've got the numbers in. We've got the national report card in, and it doesn't look so good as far as academics go over the past couple of years. So I have brought on with me Miss Erika Sanzi, the Director of Outreach at Parents Defending Education, one of my favorite organizations. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me again.
Yeah, this is going to be great. I always have fun when I talk to you and Nicole. It's awesome. I love what you guys are doing.
Thank you.
Now, before we go into the academic problem that our nation is experiencing, why don't you refresh people's memory on who you are and what your organization does?
Sure. So we're a national organization that launched in March of 2021. We're called Parents Defending Education. We're totally nonpartisan, despite what you may read in some mainstream outlets.
You're not a bunch of MAGA extremists?
No, I actually laugh because I'm like, wouldn't I have had to have voted for Trump to qualify as part of a MAGA cult? But like, I'm now apparently like in the MAGA cult, despite the fact that I actually never even voted for the guy. But anyway, so we basically are looking to bring education back to a place that is apolitical or non-political. We're very concerned about activism in the classroom. We're very concerned about how a lot of the focus on sort of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, which again, those sound benign and even virtuous when you first hear the words, but when you peel back the layers, what we really see is a suppression of viewpoint diversity. We see students and staff who ask questions being called hateful. And we see even incidences of compelled speech where students and staff feel compelled to say things that they don't believe. So we're really trying to get this sort of ideology and this activism out of the schools as best we can. And that very much includes, but is not limited to, the sort of fixation on racial ideology and gender ideology. So again, like this focus on having students at a very young age focusing on their race, dividing students up by their race, having them write about their differences based on their race, having them compare skin colors and talk about how different. I mean, just this shift away from individuals and the content of our character and finding the commonality between all of us and our humanity. What we've seen is almost like a reversal to the opposite, where they're teaching children at a very young age to focus on differences. And that's one big concern. And the other concern, which I suspect many in your audience are aware of, is this just complete explosion in children having gender dysphoria or identifying as a different gender or saying that they identify as no gender. And that, again, it's a problem in and of itself, but it's a big problem that so much of that ideology is coming from schools. And I would add, not only coming from schools, but really being done by some educational practitioners behind the backs of parents. So I guess that's where I would start. And again, our organization does everything from expose what's happening in school districts just by sharing documents from school districts, all the way up to filing lawsuits against school districts when they cross a line into something so egregious that we know it is illegal.
Yeah, and these are huge issues, and I find myself talking about these things more and more. Like, I would say at this point, about 40 to 50% of the content that I put out has to do with what's going on in these schools, because it is such an important issue, especially since, like you said, a lot of this stuff, when it concerns the gender identity and the sexuality, is being done behind parents' backs deliberately.
Yep.
And going back to what you were saying before, about schools being non-political. I mean, they are injecting politics into it, but the resistance against it isn't as partisan as these people would like you to think. This isn't about MAGA extremism. I mean, polling shows that even Democrats, people who vote Democrat, are against a lot of this stuff. You heard about that case in Dearborn, Michigan, with the group of Muslims that came to that school board meeting. Yeah, that county went like 90% for Biden. So this is not as partisan as people want to make it sound.
And it becomes a problem for all these people that spout off about intersectionality all the time, right? Because suddenly they have this intersectionality where they had, moms, lots of white moms and lots of Muslim dads coming together to make the same argument. And then it's like, well, now what do we do, right? Because it's harder to put them in that box. And what we've noticed
they won't dare to call Muslims terrorists, right?
Right. It's one thing to call me a domestic terrorist, but it's a much different thing for them to call those dads domestic terrorists. But the interesting thing is that I wasn't surprised by what was happening in Dearborn, just because the parents who reach out to us cut across all, again, ethnicities, racial backgrounds. The geography is all over the place. And even many people we hear from aren't really even political people. They're not the kind of people that are on Twitter obsessing about, local and national elections. They're just regular parents who are suddenly appalled and concerned about what their children are, again, being taught in school, bringing home from school, and then their efforts, often running into a brick wall when they want to learn more about what their children are doing in school. They really do run into a brick wall and often are told, that they can't see things, or like in a recent case out in Wisconsin, simply disagreeing with something gets them called bigots, white supremacists, homophobes, transphobes. It's a little bit ugly out there, though the optimist in me does think that we are turning a little bit of a corner, in the sense that this is really beginning to break through to the mainstream. And so the people that were telling me and others for a year none of this was happening have now shifted to, of course it's happening and it's good.
I've noticed that too. I mean, there are still people pretending like it's not happening, but I think it's just gotten so difficult now that, I mean, there's so many stories. It's like every week you've got multiple stories of schools engaging us in this behavior and infusing these ideas into the classroom to indoctrinate children. So I'm glad to see that they're not able to lie as effectively about it anymore. But even then, even when they acknowledge that it's happening, they don't really have a whole lot of arguments defending it. What they do is they just say, "Oh, you're a transphobe because you don't agree with us." That's it. It's because they know it's wrong. That's why.
Yep. Or it's like they take one super extreme example, and that's what they focus on, right? So I could use a quick example of, I don't know if people have heard of furries, but essentially it's these kids and people who dress as animals and they identify as animals. And the most common one is a cat, though some also identify as dogs. They're in the high school where I live. They're in high schools all across the country. It is an issue. So, and for most people, the issue has been that their children are getting barked at and hissed at in the hallways, right? So in addition to a new rule being allowed where, oh, you want to wear cat ears and whiskers? Well, we'll allow that. But like if somebody else were to come in a Captain America costume every day, I'm pretty sure they wouldn't allow that, right? So you have the issue of like, why are they allowed to dress a certain way? Then you have the issue of like, we have a local school board member in my state that says, well, if that's how they identify, we have to respect that. So that's the other issue. And then you have like this barking and this hissing that gets tolerated. But what's the story they've grabbed onto? The story they've grabbed onto is this claim that has gone, viral, that schools have litter boxes in schools.
Right. I heard about that.
Now, I have heard that. I have not seen anyone be able to corroborate that. And I have pointed out to many people that like, it's easy to jump on this litter box train, but there is no evidence that that is happening. And as soon as I see some, I'd be happy to share it. But what they've done is they've instead made it seem like all the other stuff related to these students that are dressing as animals and identifying as animals, that they ignore all of that and instead they pretend that everybody who's talking about it or concerned about it is a liar because they're making up lies about litter boxes.
Wait,
That's an example of kind of what they do. And we see it on every issue. They take like one super extreme, potentially false thing that got reported, and then they ignore, the 1,000 other things that have been reported and are true.
wait, okay, so I want to back up a little. We're going to get to the national report card in a second, but I didn't know about this. Like I heard about the litter box story. And when I looked into it, it sounded like maybe it happened once in one school and it wasn't like widespread and nobody was trying to make it sound like it was. What are you telling me, Erika, that in schools that these kids are allowed to dress up as cats and dogs and pretend to be them in class or in the class or on the campus? Or what was, I didn't hear about this one.
So that is what I'm telling you. I kind of think it varies a little bit. So like some people will be like, oh yeah, my school, they can't wear tails. But for sure, I mean, I can speak of school districts right near where I live here in the little state of Rhode Island, where like this is an issue. And it's, the whiskers, the ears, the identification as an animal. Like it isn't like, oh, this is my costume. It's kind of like I identify as.
This is my identity. Yeah.
And definitely students, again, boys and girls in different grades, absolutely say that they are barked at and hissed at by the kids. Again, I'm sure it's not all of them.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
So I'm sure, but I mean, to the point that like I've had parents calling into radio shows or reaching out to us talking about how like this is an issue in the school, particularly because they feel like there really aren't any consequences or behavioral consequences for students who are engaging in this. Now, what I'm not super clear on is when a teacher asks them a question, are they answering, pretending to be an animal, or like how disruptive is this? But I know that in Jefferson County, Colorado, this has become a big problem. Like my understanding is that the school had to send an email out that they're going to crack down on this because it really has become a problem. So the point is like, is this like the end of the world? No. Do I agree with a school board member that I need to participate in a delusion that if they identify as that, I have to respect it? No, I don't.
Yeah, that's weird. That doesn't make sense. like it's one thing if
Right?
they're
I
doing
don't have to agree with that, but like it's on the list of crazy things happening in schools. It's on the list that if you were out, like having a beer with a principal or a teacher, or maybe there's someone on I don't know, like on a kid's team where you're just chatting, they will absolutely confirm that this is a thing.
Is it? Oh my God. I mean,
but the reporting on it has again been, look at all these crazy lunatics claiming there's litter boxes in schools. Right. And then they basically, they dismiss the whole story. And I'm thinking, well, I actually think there's a story to be told about children who are allowed to, again, pretend that they are animals every day when they go to school. Right. Like you can, like the idea that you would make all of us participate in that delusion is crazy.
So, I mean, with the trans thing, and this is going to sound weird, I understand that a little bit more because people are claiming that gender dysphoria can be benefited by socially transitioning or medically or surgically transitioning. I don't agree with it. I think it's a load of crap. But what would be the rationale behind affirming that a kid is really a dog or a cat? I mean, I understand if they did it as a joke, but it sounds like this is more serious. Like, why would they want to affirm this? Like, what's the ideology here?
So I think that this has been going on, I think, for a while. You can look it up online. You'll see there's groups of people that meet. Some of them dress up in like full costumes. So it's again, I think it's this
it's a subculture.
This grasping for an identity, right? And I think also what has happened is like we've moved to a place where we almost reject truth. And so you see people identifying as different things. I mean, there is a program called Woke Kindergarten. It is beyond appalling. And there are schools, we have it documented on our website, who either use it or have it listed as a resource on their websites. In that Woke Kindergarten, that's what it's called, the teacher of that, or the person who runs it, who is non-binary, she goes by the name Key, or I'm sorry, they, I don't even know what the pronoun is, but whatever. So, and I'm not being disrespectful.
No,
It's
I know.
very difficult to
It's
navigate.
confusing.
So he states to children in kindergarten that they can identify as anything they want, including a tree. That's what she teaches kindergartners, and that's a resource that schools recommend. So if you're telling students they can identify as a tree, or, many years ago back, I remember Phil Donahue would have a show and he'd have these people on, they were adults, they identified as babies. So like there
Yeah.
are these weird groups out there. The difference is we were never told that if we didn't accept it, agree with it, embrace it, that, that we were hateful.
Yeah, we're the
Or that we
problem.
weren't being inclusive. Like if I don't let you identify as a baby and come to class like in diapers with a baby bottle, then that makes me not inclusive. I don't believe in diversity, and I'm a hateful person, and I don't care if people feel like they belong. This is how this goes now, right? Where of course it's not that. It's just like, don't make me like play your game, but don't make it the default that all of us have to play that game too.
Wow. I learned something new, but I kind of regret learning that now because now I'm going to go down the rabbit hole. I'm going to look it up and see what's going on. But wow. Anyway.
And again, is it the biggest problem? No. Is it a symptomatic of a larger problem? Yes. I have one friend who she literally, anytime the topic comes up, she just bursts out laughing. Like she can't help it. Like it's so ridiculous to her. But then we have other people who are, think that we should be taking it seriously and that we need to be respecting these identities and making accommodations. Okay, but no, I don't agree.
Yeah, I mean, in and of itself right now, it may not be that big of an issue, but I mean, they are trying to push us into this post-truth society to where everybody has their own truth. So if you want to be a bird, you're a bird. And, I don't know exactly what their end result is, but I know it's not anything good. So, I mean, I laugh at it, but at the same time, it's like, what are they really trying to do here?
And the other thing too is this is a school. This is supposed to be an institution dedicated to learning, right? Creating, good citizens who are, able to go on and live a prosperous and fulfilling life, right? We want every single student to be able to become the best version of themselves and reach their full potential.
Mm-hmm.
If a kid wanted to dress like this outside of school, who cares? The problem now is that what's supposed to be an academic institution, and it's not only about academics, obviously, right?
Sure.
There's a lot of socialization that goes on. You have friendships, you make relationships, you play sports, you're in theater, you build your talent as a trumpeter. So I don't mean to imply it's only about academics, but this is not supposed to be a place that's a clown show.
Mm-hmm.
And yet increasingly that seems to be what's happening. So to the point about, what we're going to talk about with these scores, how is that surprising? The focus is so shifted and they're spending so much time, focusing on all of these issues that are not only really, in my opinion, I think that the schools are way out of their lane in a lot of ways,
Mm-hmm.
but they're not helping them towards their mission. Students are not better readers. Students are not better at math. They are not better at analyzing a text. They're not better at, coming up with a thesis statement, providing evidence. They're getting worse at that, right? But instead, we were all focused on all this other stuff. And the reason that that's also a problem is that all that other stuff, you're serving a diverse community in terms of people's worldview and their values. And yet all of these very sort of values heavy topics now have come to dominate the school system. And if you're a person that's on the far left, or you're really progressive, or you're really down with all this, then I could see how you would love this, but that's not really most people. And as it has shifted so much more, I mean, let's remember, schools always leaned a little left. If you did the polling, you always saw that, 90% of teachers were Democrats. No big deal. You had that teacher that would, was obsessed with Teddy Roosevelt, and he would do, 15 units on Teddy Roosevelt and skip some other stuff. There was always a lean, but this isn't a lean. This is an ideology that is, and honestly what it is, it's very much like what I think is happening to the president, where you have activists come in and they kind of take over, and then those in charge lose control, or they're afraid to stand up, to these new people, or they're afraid to be called names. And suddenly, again, some of our best schools and our best districts are they're going down the tubes fast.
Yeah, so let's get into the academics here. So the National Assessment of Education Progress released their national report card, and it didn't look good. As a matter of fact, even if you go back years before COVID, there's a lot of depressing data on there.
Yes.
But the most recent, it showed that scores for reading and math had dropped significantly over the past 2 years during the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, most children were forced to learn from home. So it's not like they weren't having classes, but they weren't in the school campus. So what would you attribute this drop to?
So I think that this is a really tough, tricky conversation for the people who are trying to draw a straight line, right? They want school closures to explain the drop, and they want schools being open to explain why there were no drops. But it just doesn't cut that neatly. Now,
Right.
it is true that we did see bigger losses in schools the longer they stayed closed. That is true. It's also true that we saw no losses in Catholic schools and in schools run by the Department of Defense, both of which were much more likely to be open. And even within a mile radius, right? A public school would be closed and the Catholic school a mile away was open.
Right.
But, there's outliers for sure. There's some states, for example, that they didn't see decreases in their scores, but they saw no statistically significant change. I'm pretty sure there's not a single state at all in math or reading in grade 4 or grade 8 that saw increases. So this was either stagnation or drops, but mostly drops and some very, very big ones. Now, Massachusetts saw a very big drop. I believe Maryland also saw big drops. New Jersey, some of these states that are considered, the top states for education, they did see drops and they also weren't open. Then Los Angeles was closed for a really long time and they didn't see those significant drops. So, and then the other thing that's tricky is it's like everybody wants to make it red state, blue state, but in a red state, you still might have a big city that's more blue that was closed a lot longer. So for example, like New York, what people in upstate New York experienced was very different than what people in New York City experienced. And then you have the added disruption of like where I live, for example, we were an outlier state, a blue state that really didn't close. Except for the first 3 months, March 2020, I think it was, right, when everybody shut down. But then the next year we were back in. Yes, it was hybrid every other day. So what we got right in my state was we kept schools open. What we got wrong, in my opinion, is that because the quarantine policies for students were so draconian, yeah, your school's open, but if you were an unvaccinated kid on the football team, anytime a kid on your team got COVID, you had to quarantine for 10 days. And there was no remote instruction offered.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And that was, again, that was a statewide decision because we're so small. A lot of our decisions end up being statewide. But that was a statewide decision. It is my belief, again, only my belief, speaking for myself, not my organization. It is my belief that they did that because as a way to coerce people into getting their kids vaccinated. They knew that if they made it untenable enough, if you had been, 1 quarantine, 2 quarantines, now your kid's missing his games, missing practice, missing all their classes, you could drive a parent crazy. Especially if the people had young kids, because now you have my 8-year-old daughter, not mine, but I'm pretending to be someone else. Somebody has an 8-year-old daughter, quarantined once, quarantined twice, parents do shift work. Nobody can stay home with her. So the option now is now they're leaving little kids home alone. So it's just, they pushed parents to the brink. And it is my belief that they knew if they did that, they'd be more likely to get those vaccination numbers up. And then, people running for office could brag about how high their vaccination numbers were for kids. I find the whole thing grotesque, but that's what I think happened. But we were an outlier. Like a lot of states, these kids were out of school for, for a really long time, for almost that whole second year.
Yep. Yep.
Now, so that's like one piece. So again, it's not as easy and convenient because state level data is it's almost too crude. Like it doesn't tell you enough. You really have to look. Like one thing I thought was interesting today is I saw that the boys who dropped in reading, so boys are behind girls anyways in reading, but then it was the boys that were already at the lowest point that really fell more. Whereas on the girls' side, what I saw was that the girls at the top and the girls at the bottom saw declines. Now that's probably because there's a lot more girls at the top, to be honest. Like when you look at usually when you look at data like that, like there's just so many more boys way at the bottom than girls. So that could be part of it. But the point is like, this is like, there's so much to look at and there's a lot of people really good at that. So people should begin just to pay attention as people begin to, they get past the first couple of days of like, told you so. And then they get into it'll be interesting to see what that is. But the thing is too, is like state level data is also showing us really sort of bad signs. The ACT data was also really bad. It was like the lowest level for the ACT test that lots of kids take for college. It was like the lowest scores. I forget in how many years, 20 years, 30 years, something like that.
Oh, wow.
So there's like a lot of data points to tell us. And the thing is it's also like in a place like Virginia, well, not only did they close schools, they've been like equity obsessed. So they were, getting rid of advanced classes. They were beginning to, make it so that if you needed acceleration, you couldn't have it. Or if you were like ready for a much harder work, you couldn't have it. Like everybody kind of had to come down to this like mid-range. And they've also just been so focused on some of this like race and gender stuff that takes away time from instruction. It creates a pretty, unpleasant environment for a lot of people. And so I just think that a lot of schools are seeing, results of the pandemic, but also results of or consequences from choices that they made about how to run their schools and what to prioritize.
Yeah. And I definitely agree with your opinion on how they basically pressured parents into getting their kids vaccinated. Because I saw what you described, I saw in other areas across the country as well. It was disgusting.
I'll be honest, I fell for this. Like this, they pushed me to the point. I was really, really unsure of what I wanted to do because I have all boys who fall into this category where this myocarditis rate is high. And granted, people tried to call me an anti-vaxxer, told me I was lying, I was making it up, that wasn't happening, blah, blah, blah. And they first allowed 16-year-olds to get it. And there wasn't as much information then. So my oldest was like, they were allowed to get it. I didn't even barely think about it at all because at that time they didn't have this information. But then my middle one, when he was allowed to get it, we knew a lot more. And I was unsettled. And I remember that I listened to a bunch of doctors. And one of the recommendations was, if you had an adolescent boy, how scary is it they even had to say this, was to space out the shots as long as you could. So don't follow this 3-week, 21-day protocol between shots, but it was to space them out as long as you could and to have them avoid working out or like heavy like cardio exercise the following days after. Because what the pattern they were seeing, and I spoke to a pediatric cardiologist about this, the pattern they were seeing was that after the second shot, the kids that were running into trouble were kids who had really physically exerted themselves in the day or two right after.
Wow.
So I found out from my state government, what's the longest time between shots you can go and still be considered vaccinated by the state. And that was 42 days. So you were allowed to double the Pfizer recommendation. So I dragged it out as long as I could. I kept him out of athletics for a couple days. But honestly, like that was very much because he was a 9th grader at a new school on the football team, and him being kept out of school repeatedly was not just making me crazy, but I was like, this is so bad for him. This is the very beginning of a new school. I just was, it's untenable. And I had people all over I can't believe you gave in, I can't believe that you would put something in your child's body that you're not sure about just so we could go to school. And again, like I understand everyone's perspective, but at the end of the day, like you have to do what you think and you're weighing the risks. And at the time, the risks were, again, the risk was lower than what they're sort of saying now.
Right. Right. And
So,
and that actually speaks to how both sides of this debate got on my nerves, honestly. Like the pro-vax mandate, can't stand them. But the people on the other side of the coin can be just as bad. Like, oh, if you
oh
take the
God,
vaccine.
yeah.
I mean, yeah,
Because it's
basically.
human nature. Because it's human nature, and human nature is like equally bad everywhere, right? So, and a lot of people would have just probably chosen not to really share this. I had shared it a while back because I was trying to help people see that like a lot of us are just kind of grappling with what to do. We're getting information, we're asking questions, and I don't know, like I just kind of felt like it was important to be honest about that process.
It is important because to me, it was a fear mongering. Like both sides were telling me that I was going to die if I didn't do what they said I should do. Like I got
Not
the
and not only
initial,
that, you were going to kill other people.
yeah, yeah. Or they would say, oh, if you get the vaccination, you're going to die. Well, chances are on both sides, you're not going to die. I mean, I got the initial vaccination, but I refused to get boosted. I wasn't going to do that. And then I ended up getting COVID like 6 months after I took the vaccination. And now
I
I'm really not.
remember.
Yeah,
I
exactly.
remember because we were supposed to do our talk. So it's
Yeah.
funny, like in my family, I also have had really different opinions on this, and I wish people could be more nuanced, right? Like my opinion about my parents, especially my dad, who's had 2 kidney transplants, was
Mhm.
obviously different than my opinion for my very healthy teenage sons.
That's what I was saying. Yeah, and that was my exact point. Like, there is no one size fits all. It depends on the situation. I was saying, don't buy into either. Talk to your doctor. You know your situation, and you decide whether you want to take the vaccination or not. I was never against the vaccination. I was against the mandates. If
Me
somebody
too.
feels like they need to do that, if they have some other health issues, then fine, take the vaccine. If you feel like you'll be okay without it, then don't take it. Like, there's no need to try to fearmonger either side. Like, we put politics into everything. I'm like, these are health decisions. So what
Yeah.
works for one person might not work for another. Just like you said, with your grandparents, it might be different from your kids.
Yeah. No, it was really frustrating. And I was always the kind of person that like I had so many people in my life that were getting like every shot and every booster, other people that were getting none, some that were getting half. And like that was fine. So when I would hear people who couldn't, I can't talk to that person anymore or whatever, I'm like, this is so strange. Like nobody did this about other shots that kids got or didn't
Mhm.
get, or like sometimes like, often they give like a lot at the same time on one day, but then
Yep.
some parents say, I'm not doing that. I'm gonna, they like to space them out. Like, who, fine. Like,
Yeah.
it's just so strange that, so anyway, yeah, but I do think that again, that pressure that parents felt largely came from the schools creating an untenable situation because
Right.
you're open, but how open are you if the same kids keep getting quarantined over and over again because they were a close contact? I mean, I was like, that's especially because these were all asymptomatic. I mean, the kids weren't sick.
Right. Right.
But anyway, yeah. So, and that's another reason why I feel like the NAEP, when people talk about the national report card or the nation's report card now, it's like there's just like so many different variables. Cause like, yeah, you might have been open, but some kids might have been out a ton because they couldn't go to
Mhm.
school because they weren't. And so in districts where you had a much higher vaccination number for students, they got more school than in the schools where you had lower vaccination rates for students because they ended up quarantined at home.
Yeah. And you know what? And I want to go back to something that you said earlier about, you know, uh, Catholic schools. I had an interview with Kathleen Porter McGee. I'm not sure if you're familiar with
Mm,
her. Yeah.
yes.
So we talked all about how Catholic school enrollment rose by like at least 3% over this whole time period. And magically their their academic scores haven't gone down. And so she was telling me stories about parents, going to like driving by a Catholic school and seeing that it was open, turning around and going to see about getting their kids in there, because I get that a lot of parents were on board with the lockdowns and with the school closures, but a lot weren't. So why do you think that these politicians didn't listen to parents? Obviously, if the enrollment went up, that meant that their parents wanted their kids in schools, even in the middle of the pandemic, because they knew that it would most likely be okay. But they didn't listen. So why do you think they didn't listen to parents, to what parents wanted?
Yeah, I mean, this is a weird thing. I was always a little jaded and cynical, but now it's like I almost feel like I'll never ever forget what happened in this situation, right? Where I mean, I always knew that the teachers unions had a ton of power. They give all their money to Democrats. They get, very they have almost like direct line access to the Oval Office. Like I knew all that. But to see the level of coordination between the president, in this case, the Biden administration, and the union leaders in an effort to basically extort. It was basically like, we will not open unless you give us this money. And even in the beginning, we saw them making other demands. They wanted demands about, they didn't want charter schools, and they wanted, they were getting into like national political issues related to abortion and guns. And I'm like, what the heck? So it's really all about power.
Mm-hmm.
And I knew that, but I never really thought that they'd be like willing to work tirelessly to lock children out of their schools, especially in the case where like Randy Weingarten is the president of the AFT, and they tend to be the union affiliated with like big city school systems, whereas like suburban districts tend to be NEA. So it's like she knew that these school systems were full of children that were already behind, many of whom lived in poverty, many of whom were struggling for a whole host of reasons. And she did everything she could to keep the doors to their schools locked.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's like, I do feel like monstrous is the word. I used it at the time, and I still think that. And I actually referred to her as a villain in all of this. And my husband thought that was like inappropriate. And like, I shouldn't be, speaking with, I shouldn't be, because I'm not a name caller usually. And I try not to get into that tone. But I said to him, I was like, I agree with you, except in this case. I was like, in this case, I feel comfortable saying that Randy Weingarten was a villain in this pandemic, and that's going to become clearer, as we look back over time. But I don't know. I really do not know. I mean, how it could be that so many, I mean, I do think that part of it was that some progressives really believed all the COVID hysteria. They really believed if you didn't wear a mask, you were going to kill someone. I mean, they were like, almost like something had switched in their brain, and like a hypochondria had set in. I mean, you even still see them now, like they're like appalled that we're not all still wearing masks and social distancing. So I do think some of that also, there were a lot of really left-leaning school boards making decisions. You'd see them all masked up in their, not just, when they were around people, but alone, and in photographs when they were alone and
in their car driving alone.
Yeah, although I did do that once or twice, and I was like, oh my God, I'm now one of those people. You forget it's on.
Well, yeah. If you forget that it's on, I've done that before too. It's one thing if you forget that you have it on, but it's another if you're doing it on purpose.
So, I mean, I think there were true believers. I really think there were true believers that were like, we have a moral obligation to keep these schools closed so that, these kids don't go home and kill their grandparents. And then I think that there was a little bit of, from some, certainly not all. I mean, in my district, for example, like the teachers really wanted to get back to school. They were really angry about the closures. I think we had like 70% wanted to reopen, but in some places, majority of teachers didn't want to go back. So that became, I think, a problem, because now, you're dealing with what parents want versus what the teachers want. But what I will say is, at the end of the day, I feel like children came last, and then parents were like second to last. And again, I think that's partly because generally speaking, school boards, they do their thing. They're not used to much scrutiny. They don't get very much comment during public comment, except maybe once in a while some issue blows up. So there's just so little accountability in those roles. And suddenly they were under a microscope and they were hearing from parents. And again, not all did this, but way too many became immediately confrontational and adversarial
Mm,
and
yeah.
condescending. And so, and I think once that was established, it was, I think, hard to recover
Mm,
from that maybe.
mm,
Again, it's hard to say, but when you go from, and let's remember too, the parents weren't only mad at them because they didn't open schools. They were mad at them now because they were seeing what they were teaching their kids
yep.
because the schools weren't open. So it
Yep.
was more, it wasn't just like, it was like, you're not just damaging my child and my family in one way, you're damaging my child and family in lots of ways, and that's not acceptable.
Yeah, yeah. It was almost like, why are you locking our kids out of class? Like, why are you not letting them attend? Wait, hold up. Wait. What are you teaching them in the first place? Wait, well, I didn't know about this. Like, that's what happened. I mean, that's a silver lining, because a lot got exposed. I mean, I don't like the way it got exposed, because that means that these kids weren't getting the education that
Right.
they needed. But that is something to take from this. So my question in that vein is, now that COVID isn't really a thing now, I mean, it's harder to justify locking down schools. Do you expect the scores to go back up, or what do you think might happen?
So that's going to be interesting because, well, I think for lots of reasons, because let's remember, we were already not doing well.
Yeah.
This has been a major disruption. And for some children, this disruption came in those very formative years that are very hard to catch up. So
Mhm.
if a child, missed their reading milestones in first and second grade, well, if a child's not reading on grade level by third grade, it's very, very hard for them to ever catch up. So it's going to require targeted interventions. And I think that we're seeing that, especially, and that's going to be the same for math, where when you miss so much, because it wasn't just, oh, I don't do math now. It's almost like I don't do school, right? The whole
Right.
feeling about school changed. And that's why, a lot of school districts like Providence in Rhode Island, where I live, is having a huge problem with attendance. I mean, they are just like a lot of kids. It was like they kind of never got back on the school train when
Mm,
schools reopened. Um, so if we actually do something smart, which we don't usually do, I mean, we have over 90% of the COVID money that we were told had to be spent to reopen is unspent.
yep.
So it's hard to imagine that they couldn't, use that money in some targeted way to help these kids that are really, really struggling and have fallen behind in math and reading. And while, yeah, it's all great to talk about the importance of all these other subjects, and I don't mean to diminish them, but there are basics that we need in life to be successful. And they start for sure with literacy.
Sure.
I mean, all you have to look is the illiteracy rates of incarcerated people to see that when you can't read, it is very, very difficult to have a successful, fulfilling, prosperous life.
Yeah.
And, but again, we knew that before the pandemic too,
Yeah.
and we weren't really, doing much about it. Because again, parents who have the means and know of the deficits will find a way to get their kids some help.
Right.
But most children's families don't have the means or are not going to necessarily be aware of these deficits. I mean, there's a really good piece on a website called The 74. It's written by Andy Rotherham. I think he served in the Clinton administration, big education guy. He's now was just tapped by Glenn Youngkin to serve on the Board of Ed in Virginia, but he's a lifelong Democrat, but a very sort of nuanced guy that's good at, working across the aisle and being nice to
Mhm.
people, regardless of their political affiliations. And he has a good piece, I think it came out yesterday, where he talks a lot about the absolute necessity of leveling with parents, being honest with parents about where their kids are, what these scores mean. Because schools have historically not done a very good job at that. They don't, yeah, like something might come home in an envelope or something might come home in an email, but again, to most parents, they're busy. They don't know what it means necessarily. Now, if they're new to the country, if English isn't their first language, right? If they're totally overwhelmed, there's a good chance they're not even going to catch that email, let alone have a real understanding of like what this means. And because grade inflation is such a problem, parents are looking at report cards that have A's and B's, A's and B's, A's and B's, A's and B's. My kid's doing great. My kid's doing fine. They don't realize that the grades are not reflective at all of their
Right.
children's actual mastery and proficiency. And so that's how they end up wondering, wait a second, how is my kid in the 6th percentile for reading? And he has, an A or a B in all of his English classes.
Mhm.
Right. And again, parents who aren't dialed in on this, who don't think in, live and breathe and think education all the time, are going to
Most
assume that a
don't.
good
Yeah.
report card means that the kid is fine. And in many cases, that is simply not the case.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like government sponsored fraud. It is
Mhm.
fraud,
It
because you're
is.
telling these parents that their kids are doing just fine in math and English, and then they graduate and they're not reading past the 3rd grade level. Like I've seen that happen all over the country, and it's so this actually just leads to my last question. I mean, do you think that these people can be held accountable? And if so, how? How do we hold them accountable for what they did all throughout the COVID regime, but even just the fraud that they've been perpetrating when it comes to education?
Yeah, I mean, I saw Rory Cooper has a piece in the Daily Beast today talking about how he really thinks that the 2 union leaders should be brought in for hearings,
Mhm.
the NEA and the AFT. And that's a pretty like strong statement for Rory Cooper to make, but I agree with him. I really do think we can't let people off the hook when they say that the pandemic caused this.
Right.
No, people in positions of power made decisions, and these are the consequences of those decisions, right? It's not the pandemic. And so I don't know. I mean, I've always been a very outspoken supporter of school choice, whether that's a public charter school, a Catholic a school, any other sort of religious school, homeschooling, a micro school. I don't really care. I know that there's no way one size could ever fit all. It doesn't even do that in a family. How's it going to do it for, everybody out there? And I am a big believer that if anything, the the system as it stands, it's not going to go away. And it actually does work for lots of people, right? There are people that for whom it works. But I do think that everybody needs access to an escape hatch if it doesn't work. And that could be that your child has dyslexia and your school doesn't teach reading in a way that your child ever has a chance of learning to read. That, get them out. Your oldest child is doing great at a school, but your youngest child is relentlessly bullied and miserable and like this school's
Mhm.
not working, right? Get them out. And so I do think that the work of Corey DeAngelis at the American Federation for Children, he's the guy that's always talking about funding students, not systems.
Right.
I'm on board with that, right? Because these are tax dollars that attach to children and nobody is entitled to them. The local district thinks they're entitled to them, but they're not. And so there's got to be ways for, people to exit. I have been listening for over a decade to people, including Elizabeth Warren, saying, well, you just need to wait. You just need to stick it out. You just need to try to make it better. Well, she didn't do that.
No, she
She put
sure as
her
hell
own money,
didn't.
put him in a private school, right? And
Mhm.
so to me, it's like you can't keep telling people they need to wait. And the truth is like that falls disproportionately on people who don't have the means to, pay for alternatives. That
Yep.
generally falls on people who live in communities that have low performing schools and they have been low performing for generations.
Yep.
So which is also kind of strange because like the more progressive a person is, the more opposed they are to school choice. And
Yep.
I'm thinking, how does your sort of like progressivism, how does that jive at all with trapping predominantly Black and brown children, but certainly not only, in failing schools that have been failing for generations.
That's part of the plan. That's the part that they don't say
Knowing,
out
by the
loud.
way, knowing that Black families and Hispanic families overwhelmingly support having more options for their children. The number is lowest with white liberals.
Yep.
What a surprise.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and I do think that the needle on school choice has moved considerably because of the pandemic. There have been a lot of school choice policies. Again, sometimes they only apply to low-income children. Sometimes they only apply to children with special needs. In Arizona, it's universal. They just passed a universal one, so it applies to anybody. But I think that that's really, really important because, you know, the big 1,000-person high school that works really well for some kids, not going to work for other kids. It's not.
Mhm.
And especially when those needs, like when you're talking about reading disabilities and you're talking about, you know, issues around bullying, those are like two examples where I
Yeah.
just feel like you can't wait. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, it becomes pretty clear, like if the school is unable or unwilling to address a situation where a child is literally being like tortured, like you can't
Mhm.
wait. And the same goes with these kids who can't read. No matter how hard they try, they're being taught to read in a way that doesn't work for them.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and being in Texas, I mean, a lot of people think that because it's a red state that it's not a big deal, but schools in Texas all over the place are teaching this problematic material. And
Oh yeah.
I'm going to be going to a school board meeting probably in a couple of weeks to cover the protest that's going to happen. It's happening all over the state, but Texas doesn't really have school choice like that. So parents should be given an off ramp if they don't want their kid. If you want your kid learning that, that's up to you. I don't have to agree with it, whatever. But if you don't, you should be able to pull your kid out and take them to a different school. So I'm hoping that in our next legislative session, which is happening next year, that we're going to be passing school choice. And I know DeAngelis has actually been involved in that. So hopefully that happens. But
Yeah, Texas is weird in that way. Like, it's not weird that my state's so bad on that issue, I feel like, because we're like a very blue state, but it's
yeah,
weird that you guys are so bad on that issue.
they've been trying to do it for decades, and you've got Republicans who are against it.
But to quote my boss, Nikki, she'll say, like, if you want to send your kid to Social Justice Academy, go ahead. Just don't do it on the public dime. Right? But that public schools where teachers and administrators are hired as state speech should not be putting their thumb on the scale in one direction, ideologically, politically, whatever it is. Now, do I think that there are really robust debates that can be had, especially at the high school level? I do.
Yeah.
So like, I would never say that the 1619 project has no place in schools. I would say that the 1619 project has no place in schools if it is presented as the only viewpoint.
Facts. Yeah.
But if you took, a critic of Nicole Hannah-Jones's, or if you took, even if you just took clips or writings of Glenn Lowry and you put it up with Nicole Hannah-Jones and you let the kids read it and then you let them discuss it and then they get to, land where they land, that would be a really healthy exercise, I think.
Yeah, I'd be okay with that in high school, definitely.
But so some places are the pendulum goes so far. Now I understand why they want to get the 1619 project out. It's because it hasn't been presented that way. It is being presented as this is a fact. So again, that is a problem. But so there's lots of these issues that I feel like, could be discussed. The difference is you can let students take an issue like voter ID, and you can, again, have them read the most compelling arguments for and against, and they can wrestle with the idea and decide what they think, and they can, present their opinion and back it up, right? That would be a good exercise. That is not what we see. What we now see, and it is written in classroom materials, we see a proclamation that voter ID is racist.
Yep.
Now, people have every right to believe that, but that is not an appropriate thing to be teaching in a school. Could you have a debate about voter ID, pros and cons? Absolutely. Same with the patriarchy. Oh, you want to claim you live in a patriarchy? give the best evidence for and against, let the kids read it, wrestle with it, discuss it, fight about it, whatever, and then let them say what they think. But instead on the paper, what we see is that America is a patriarchy.
Right.
Again, that is not teaching, that is
That's
indoctrination.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
exactly.
those are just two examples, but there's so much of that everywhere. And that is like a separate problem, again, from the hypersexualization of young children, which is really what is mobilizing parents now. Because now you've got kids who believe in the tooth fairy and Santa Claus being taught material that is so, again, we could debate what grade it belongs in and if it belongs, but it doesn't belong in elementary school.
It definitely does not. No, not even close.
And yet, again, like to some people, they can't, they're like, how could you think that? And I'm like, oh my God. So yeah, anyway.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, we could talk about this for days on end. I'm sure we will again, but
anytime.
Yeah, but before we sign off, why don't you let everybody know where they can find you?
Sure. So I'm at Parents Defending Education. Our website is defendinged.org. So if you ever have anything happening in your school that you're looking for help or support with, you can reach out to us there. Again, defendinged.org. We also have lots of resources for parents, not just parents, actually, anybody, but especially parents. Mm-hmm. And my email, my professional email, if you want to reach me, is Erika with a K at defendinged.org. And then I am on Twitter at esanzi. My last name is SANZ as in zebra I. Oh, and I also write on Substack, although it's been a while, and that's sanzi.substack.com.
Awesome. Well, thank you for joining in. I can't wait to do it again.
Thanks, Jeff. Have a great day.
You too.